you very much for the invitation to this conference and in particular to this panel. And thank you very much for your introduction. Though, one personal remark related to that brings me into the 3.5 points I want to address. Since you have said that I'm in Cologne, that's true, since April 2014. But since then, I'm not anymore the managing director of the Stiftung Niedersächsische Gedenkstätten or Bergen-Belsen Memorial. That means, in a sense, since a year I shifted roles from memory to history or to historiography, so to say, or from the politics of memory to historiography in an academic institution. I think I still carry both roles, in particular from my personal experiences in the past, very well with me, and nevertheless want to address rather the role of the historian from an academic institution. Having said that, I want to thank Richard Overy for this wonderful keynote, which I fully agree with, in particular with your approach, in particular to differentiate between history and memory and to put it into a more differentiated relation. Although we know that we cannot really separate history, historiography, and memory, from the cultural point of view, they are always related to each other. And there's no kind of objective stance which we can ask for coming from historiography telling us what the truth is. Nevertheless, historiography may have and has, to my mind, a specific purpose when it comes to the questions that are addressed on this conference and on this panel. Not to overstate their importance, but at some point it might be helpful to have that kind of thought experiment and to position that a bit. We were asked to be short, so I have 3.5 points dwelling on that. And I want to overall want to say we have to try to disconnect history, historiography, and memory as much as possible as a starting point to get a better understanding of what European remembrance, remembering, and history means. My first point, we should not strive for a common memory. We should not try to define a common memory, and we should not try to use certain models or patterns or terminologies of memory to define what belongs to the common memory and what does not belong to it. We should not use universal terms or general terms in order to imply into that understanding of memory the use and the basis of foundation of universal values. But we should disagree on what history or memory means to us. In the introduction to this conference, I read the sentence, "This is a forum to present different but equally important national and local historical narratives." And I fully agree that this is an important task. But what we can learn from the research on memorial cultures, and this is part of a memorial culture, is that it's not about presenting equally important narratives. It is about discussing, criticizing, and disagreeing about narratives. And this has to be done from a position which is defined by a historiographical or otherwise defined academic discourse. That's my first point. We have to find forums where we can disagree and have to, because that's the only way which makes history and memory as clear and sharp as possible to us. Secondly, my second point to disconnect history and memory, or historiography and memory, and we should not use lessons which we draw in that field of memory to legitimate any kind of political systems or national narratives or state-building measures. We have to disconnect values and memory. We should not use memory in order to build up values, although this is the fully common educational approach. Most of you will work, and as I said, my background is very much funded in memorial sites. That is the background we or those sites work on. Memory serves the purpose to establish certain values, and sometimes basic values. From empirical experience, I would say we know that doesn't work. It has to be the other way around. We have to have the values first, and then we have to discuss what memory means, and we come to a very different kind of memory, perhaps. My third point, we should be very careful when we use any kind of umbrella terminology and what it means. And that refers obviously to the use of the umbrella terminology totalitarian regimes. And I'm very thankful that Richard overused that term, although made clear that it should not serve for any kind of equivalence or simplified equivalence. We have to compare, nevertheless, definitely, in order to get a sharper picture of that what happened. But we should not use those umbrella terminologies in order to avoid our disagreement. And that refers also to the term Holocaust. What I observe is that the term Holocaust has become not only a term to describe or term the murder of the European Jews, but to become a kind of umbrella term which tries to include all kind of Nazi crimes. And I don't think that this is helpful. It's also a very difficult umbrella term because it does not help us to understand the differences and the similarities and the relations of Nazi crimes to each other when we use a term which has been invented for a different and a very specific kind of Nazi crimes as an umbrella term, as I said that. And we should be careful because, and that is my most important, I would say, but my 3.5 point or my 3.5 point, all what I've said is linked up by a shift in paradigm I'm arguing for, I want to argue for. It's very normal and understandable and also common. Meanwhile, also in historiography, because a colleague of mine has recently argued we need a specific field of victim research as a sub-branch of historiography, it has become common since the 1960s, and I would say, could discuss that a bit more, that since the end of the 1960s, we have in politics, memory, and also partly in historiography, a kind of victim culture. The focus is on the victim and has shifted towards the victim. In terms of memory and giving the individual victims and those who suffered their history back, I fully agree with that. But I doubt that this is the real and sufficient basis for future memory. I would rather argue, as a consequence of what I've said, that we need a European culture of perpetrator research and a European network of perpetrator research. It has been said in the panel before that there is a point in empathy. I think, Ms. Carmichael, you said that. There is a point in empathy But I think it leads us at some point to the wrong direction, or to a direction which does not give us the full picture of history which we need. We need a non-empathic approach to understand our history in Europe. A non-empathic approach which allows us to discuss and discover all implications perpetratorship, in a broad sense, in a very broad sense, has and means to our European history, and also including that to global history. If we understand the differences in history and of these different regimes from the perspective of perpetratorship, at least I come to then finally, and that's my last point, or the end of my 3.5 point, I come to something which then puts not the Holocaust in the understanding of the murdering of the European Jews, but the racist, genocidal, imperialist crimes of the Nazi regime in its entirety into the center of European history. So it's about understanding that we should not separate and cannot separate Nazi crimes from each other once we understand it from a non-empathic approach, which helps us to see that there has been no other genocidal regime like the Nazi regime in the world, and in history, I would say, at least in modern history, no other genocidal regime where the perpetrators and all those who collaborated were that distinctive in their willingness and their intentions, not to kill only Jews because they were Jews, but to kill many other groups, people, and nations, or the citizens of these nations, from a biological, biopolitical, and racist perspective. And this can be understood, as I would argue, from a non-empathic approach that requires, and that also in a comparative and entangled perspective from a shift to perpetrator research as the basis of future memory. Thank you.